All right, so honestly, I made this a little, I'm just gonna back y'all up and tell y'all what I've done so far. But what I did was, I started with a piece of sheet metal, and I'm gonna go ahead and tell you guys that we are out of copper sheet. And I know a lot of y'all like to work with copper better than brass and silver nickel. But what I'm gonna do to make mine look copper is I'm just gonna put it in the regular pickle instead of the super pickle, and that will copper plate it, and it will just look copper. And that's our cheap way of making copper since we are out, okay? But you can do this with any of the three metals, and it's a nice because or if I were to leave it brass and the spinner ring were to be copper, then that's a nice kind of mixed metal look as well. So you can mix the metals as much as you want. I would not recommend silver nickel for the thick band because it's harder to bend and because so many people do have the skin allergies to silver nickel, okay? But what I did is I cut it to 3/8 thickness, and then I used my ring sizing chart to determine, all right, I'm a size 6, and I was looking at 20 gauge, so I did 54 millimeters, but then I added 3 millimeters because of it being so wide. So that put me at 57 millimeters. And if y'all need me to re-walk y'all through all of that later, we can in terms of using this, because I know it's been a little while for everyone. I also did not measure it until after I chose, now you could have done it plain, but I chose to print it on the rolling mill so that it had a pretty texture on it. And I didn't measure it and cut it until after I did that, because when I go it through the rolling mill, what does it do to the metal? It stretches it, so I would have had to recut it, okay? Technically, I would file this down real nice and make sure all my edges are really smooth, but I'm gonna go quicker because I don't want to keep y'all here till midnight. Okay, so we're gonna start by getting that D shape where we're gonna bend it so that those two ends close up on each other, and obviously the more secure of a bond that they have or of a connection, the better the solder is gonna be, okay? And this is really thick, so the hardest part about soldering this shut is making sure that you control that flame on the torch so that the solder evenly flows through that whole seam, because that's going to be a thick seam to solder shut. On the torch, it's going to be a little bit interesting. But I'm really taking my time to finagle this because I want to get as secure of a bond as I possibly can. And remember, just like we did with the bangle, you can push it past and then past again like that until there's really a very, very tight bond, because the solder won't fill any holes, remember? No, it's because I'm using the chain nose instead of the flats, and I was rushing a little bit, so I can't get it quite the way I want it. But I'm taking the time, because if I rush and try to solder it with a sloppy bond, there's no point in even trying to solder it, you know? So I really want to get those two marks, and it might mean pulling it apart and filing them, because if I cut one even slightly crooked, you know, there's going to be that little gap there. But I'm going for that classic D shape. Boom, right there, and a nice good connection. It is harder to bend than you think. It's 20 gauge metal. What my friend recommended to me, she said, you know, you can roll it in the rolling mill a couple of extra times to get it a little bit thinner. But then it's going to get work hardened, so you might have to heat it a little to get it, you know, soft enough. File which way?
Down.
I never
filed
right at all.
You move the file away, because when you go the other way, you're just dulling the blade. I just filed my fingernail.
That's why I hate it.
So this is almost the connection that I want. Remember, if I hold it up to the light and I can see light through it, should I solder? No, because that's telling me my solder does not fill holes. Okay, and this is actually telling me that I need to file them to get a better, because there's a little bit of like a gap like this right now in between them, and it's from where I didn't cut them as cleanly as I should have. I cut them with the joist chins because I was trying to be fast. I really should have cut them with the jeweler saw, which I know is everyone's favorite tool.
Oh my gosh,
I use it for everything.
The shear does not cut straight. The shear is not an accurate cutting tool. As easy as it is to cut, the shear is not accurate.
That was enough for me.
The shear is great for cutting when you're just trying to cut quick, but it is not great for accuracy.
I cut myself with
Okay.
Yeah.
I've got
The sheer light.
so y'all can see where there's air, but I'm going to pass it around and I'm going to attempt to solder it anyways. Before I solder, I need my tweezers, my pick. I don't think, you don't have to pick solder. I'm actually not going to, but I always like to have my pick handy in case the solder jumps around on the flame. I obviously can't touch it with anything else. And when I use the tweezers to move it around, I don't really like to have the tweezers under the flame because it totally ruins the ends. They're so thin and they're so fragile. That's how they get all bent up. So the soldering pick will withstand the flame temperature much better than the tweezers. So I always want to have my pick handy even if I'm not pick soldering, because then I can get in there without having to turn the torch off or without having to put it in the water. Because once I douse it in the water, I got to pickle it again before I can, put it back under the torch. Okay, so I've got my soldering pick and my tweezers. If I need them, I've got my charcoal brick. I always cut my solder on the charcoal brick because it's just easier to see here than it is on this nasty fire brick, which is very used. Okay, so do y'all want me to pickle first or cut my solder first? Or not pickle, flux first. Okay. This is brass, and I don't think brass takes the heat as well as copper. So even though I'm only soldering the seam, I'm gonna put flux on everything inside and out. But I'm gonna, I'm gonna make sure that I get a lot. Ooh, it's dripping all over my dress.
That's why you should have an apron.
We use sheet solder, but you can also buy solder in like a stick form. It looks like wire. I don't like it because in a studio where the people are sharing, because if you look at a stick of solder, it looks just like a 20 gauge silver, and so, or like a 20 gauge silver round wire, and then people are like, is this solder or is this sterling silver? So that's why I always buy sheet solder, because it's pretty clear that this is sheet solder. It's too thin to be brass. So that's why I don't have it in a community setting, but in my studio at home I have both. But I'll cut it into little fringe-like pieces, and then just be careful whenever you're using the joist chins. They're the most dangerous material. Just reminding y'all, worse than torch and anything else, they go through your skin very easily, and they also will create flying metal. So I always cut and point down so that I can control where those pieces of solder land on the land on my brick. Okay, and I always use a charcoal brick because I lose solder here. How many of y'all lose solder on the?
I lose solder every time, all the time.
And that's okay. And I always, see, I even had a few pieces fly. I always cut extra because if for some reason I need to grab some with the pick in the middle of the torch, I don't have to actually turn off the torch and cut more solder. So then I'll put my solder back in here. Again, we're using easy because this is base metal. If I was doing this in sterling silver, I'd probably use hard solder, which that just has a different melting temperature. I'll get that back to y'all. I'm gonna clean up my workspace a little bit. Okay, so I usually put my charcoal brick off to the side, but where it's still accessible. I'm gonna move this because it's flammable out of the way. Thanks, Francisco. My handy dandy assistants on each side. Okay. Now these torches have not been turned on in a while, but the instructions are still on the board if you need them. Remember that it's acetylene, and we do have a gauge. All right. And the key is always in the cup. And remember, you always leave the key. And I'm just reminding all this because some people don't do this. Once I put the key on the tank and I turn the tank on, if it's full, the gauge should pop up. So this tank is getting low, but it still has gas. I always leave the key in the torch, because if some emergency were to happen, if the hose were to start leaking or anything were to happen, and I couldn't turn the flame off here, I can cut the gas off from the tank. And if the key isn't in the tank, I have to search for the key, and then that whole time, fire is happening. Okay, so I turn the tank on, which is a turn to the right, and then I turn the increase valve until 2 threads are showing.
I thought it was 1 thread.
1 or 2. I start with 2, and if I feel like I'm not getting a gas enough oomph, I will turn the intake valve in more. Do y'all hear the difference? Because you don't want too much gas, but you also don't want too little. You want to have a decent flame. Okay, so my torch is on and working. I have my tweezers here if I need them. And actually, since I'm not going to pick solder this, I'm going to place the solder right at the seam sideways so that it's kind of straddling. It's straddling that seam, okay? This is a 20 gauge piece of sheet metal, so to get it warm, it's gonna take a minute. Remember when we were soldering with the bangles and we were like, Ms. Majay, it's never gonna flow, the solder's never gonna flow. You know, the thicker, the heavier the metal, the longer it takes to get hot enough for the solder to flow. And that's another reason why, especially with this brass, I want to use easy solder, okay? So, where's my striker? I'm gonna get that out of the way too. All right.
I didn't know Danny to scream.
One of my students always used to scream when I light the torch. And, okay, just to review quickly, which part of the torch is the hottest?
The cone.
Okay, where the blue cone, I want to be right outside of that blue cone right there. And you have to pay attention to the way that the blue cone is pointing, because if the blue cone's pointing up, the tip is getting more of the heat, versus if the blue cone is pointing down, the middle is getting a lot of the heat. And that's the same thing pointing left to right. So a lot of y'all who are struggling with your torch, you've really got to pay attention to not just where the blue tip is, but where it's pointed. This is going to be a little bit of a struggle because the seam goes so far up and the solder is sitting on the brick. So I have to use my flame to pull the solder up over that whole seam, but I've also got to keep it left and right, because remember, just like with any of your bangles, if the left side's hotter than the right, where's the solder going to flow?
The hotter side.
The solder is going to flow to the other side. It's going to flow to the solder follows heat, period. Okay, so usually I hold the torch from underneath like that because this is not comfortable. Okay, I usually hold the torch from underneath and point it down like this, but because I'm trying to pull the heat up, because I'm trying to pull the heat up or pull the solder up, I actually think that I'm going to hold it from underneath, but with the torch more at this angle, so I actually have it upside down right now. And you can, if the torch was off, you can actually adjust the torch's pointing here. You can turn this nozzle right here. Okay, but I just think it's easier in a classroom setting to just leave the torch in one position. And I've also been talking a long time because I've been giving the flux a chance to dry, which is going to hopefully keep my solder from bouncing around on me too much. Okay, but I have my torch upside down, and didn't we do this when we did the bezel too?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, we did.
Is it
And-
horizontal?
Yeah, we did.
The piece of solder right now is horizontal, and I'm gently going back and forth over that seam. I really want to make sure that I don't let the left side get any hotter than the right side. If your arm gets tired, you can use your free hand to support it.
Do we ever have to heat the entire thing first, or no?
No, I don't want to get anywhere hot except for where I'm going to solder, because I don't want my solder to jump somewhere I don't want it to be. Okay, and remember, the flux keeps the metal clean, and clean metal is kind of important because solder doesn't like dirty metal. And my flux is going to be a good guideline to me to when my ring finally gets hot enough that my solder flows. So it starts to look like really dirty at first. I can also go up and down the seam this way. Okay, my solder flowed, but it's actually okay, I'm glad it did that. But it only flowed about halfway up. So what I'm gonna do is I'm actually gonna pick solder the other half. And it just kind of depends on what you're seeing. I'm gonna get this back hot again. I dropped it right down on the tip of that seam. Do y'all see it?
Yeah.
There's a little teeny tiny dot of silver solder right there. Y'all see it?
Okay, I see it.
Okay. I'm sorry, I have to do it facing me or else I can't see it. So. And you shouldn't hold tools in your mouth. Okay. Now that I've placed it there, I can direct my heat down a little bit, and I'm gonna try to pull my solder. But do y'all see that, like, how the flux has become like a shiny clear film? That's what at least it looks like to me. That lets me know. But my ring, and all that talking, I let my ring get cool, so now I've got to get it hot again. Why are y'all laughing so hard? What did I do? There it goes, it's flowing down. Yay! All right, so I turn my torch off. Because we are not in the best jewelry environment, we are on a wood table. So where do I always leave my torch resting? On the fire brick. Okay. I'm gonna douse this because he's hot. I always have my water within reach. Okay. Then I'm gonna use my steel plier or my steel tweezers. If it's a little stuck to the fire brick, it usually pops right off. Okay, and I talked a little bit, but y'all all know, they all go every time I drop it in the water. Okay. And it's a little dirty now. Now be careful, the fire brick is still hot. Always test your fire brick, because and especially in a shared studio space. And you're gonna see where one side is a little bit bigger than the other because I didn't file it down. And obviously it's dirty right now, so I'm gonna have to wet. Now, if I want it to look copper, I can just put it in the regular pickle. Because it's brass, if I wanted it to keep its yellow appearance, I've got to put it in the super. I just want to show y'all basically how it's going to work, and then I'm going to give y'all time to get started, and I can demonstrate all other types of things. It just kind of depends on what you want. Okay. We haven't used this much. This is one of my favorite tools. It has so many uses, but we're going to use it for something basic today. This is just a dapping set, a dapping block, and I'm going to use it to put a curve into that ring, and by putting a curve into the band, that is going to be what allows the rings on the middle not to fall off, basically. But obviously, after I'm done soldering this, I'm supposed to do what? Okay, I pickle it to get it nice and clean. For the sake of speed, I don't need y'all to sit there and watch it pickle for 5 to 10 minutes while it cleans. Okay, but I can stretch it and put it on my ring mandrel. I need to use a rubber mallet. Why?
You don't want to ruin it.
A shape, a design.
Okay. If I used a metal
stretch it.
mallet, first of all, it would change the texture of the ring, which could be nice. But it's also going to stretch it, so then it's no longer going to be my size. I've measured this to be a size 6. So hopefully, if I did a good job measuring it, when I take it off of the mandrel, it's going to fit my finger. All right? If it doesn't, I could always then use the metal mallet to stretch it out. I have my bench block here already, because I'll probably need it. And I have my cloth. I'm going to put my cloth here just to kind of absorb some of the sound. And I usually don't sit cross-legged, but I'm trying to get it high enough. I hold the base of the mandrel here, and I'll rest the tip of the mandrel up against the table. And I keep that cloth there to absorb some of the sound. And I'm using a rubber mallet. Sorry about the sound, guys. And yes, I always need to be aware of my fingers. If you want a stronger punch, you hold it down lower, because then you're letting the weight of the mallet, work for you. But I was wanting to just barely hit it. I was already wearing a ring, but today's good today, y'all. Okay. And I like it, especially because it is this thick, I like it to be a little bit bigger. So if I put it on the mandrel right now, it's actually reading between a 6 and a 6.5, almost even to a 7 if I were to stretch it a little more. But because of the thickness, that's working with my hand. I don't like rings to be tight where I feel like, oh God, I have to go to the doctor to get this off. And then, you don't want it to just be round this way. I should really, because the band is so thick, beat it on the mandrel this way, take it off and flip it over and hit it on the mandrel this way as well. But I also want to make sure that it sits flat and doesn't have that rock in it. It looks like it has a little bit of rock in it, so I'm going to use the rubber mallet to also adjust the shape this way to make sure that the ring doesn't have any type of a bend that way. And yes, for cleanliness reasons, I need to use the file to clean up my edges. I should have done that before I started soldering, but because I wanted to start the demonstration, and you can see where my block has been very beaten and worn by the different metal that it hits on. But I always put that, the ideal thing to have, by the way, y'all, is a big, and the jewelry studio where I first learned to do jewelry, they had a big wooden stump, literally from a tree. And it was just cut in half. And whenever we did any type of beating on the block or whatever, we did it on that because it was such a big, heavy piece of wood, it absorbed all the sound. Beating on a thin, hollow table like this is not the best. If y'all know anybody in the log cutting business who would like to give me a tree stump, anybody in here's parents, loggers, and I don't know it,
That would be hard.
lumberjacks.
They already plant trees, by the way.
My dad planted floor.
Okay, so I've got my ring, all right, and it fits, and in theory, I pickled it and it's nice and clean and I'm ready to move on. All right. What I'm going to do with my dapping set, and I've got to find one that's the right size. Ooh, that was pretty close. I want one that is going to fit into the ring, but that is slightly wider than the ring, because it's going to basically make the ring, instead of standing straight, it's going to make the ring bell like this. Okay, so that one was a close fit, but I want it to have a little bit of a stronger bell, so I'm going to go up one size and kind of see what that does.
Do you want it to be bigger?
Yes, it's basically, in the end, I'm going to be going for a shape like this, like an hourglass, a divot.
Do you have to push it down?
But I'm only going to divot one side first, because I have to put the other rings on, and then they get stuck on when I do the other side. Is that everybody kind of following me? All right, now, which hammer am I going to use to hit the dapping?
The plastic.
I don't know.
Not the rubber.
Why not?
Steel?
Steel, which is right behind you.
I hate that hammer.
Which is the same as the disc
I was
cutter.
looking at
Okay.
those manuals, like, what are you even
Oh, where'd
talking
you
about?
find
Remember when
it?
this
We bought
hammer
a hate the
Oh.
steel hammer.
Okay, with this one though, we're not using the disc cutter, so we're not trying to pierce a hole in the metal. We're just trying to. Chewing gum. We're just trying to slightly bend the metal. Therefore, I don't need to. Okay, it's a gentle tapping, and for me, when I want to gently tap, especially because I'm not working with hammers and power tools all the time, I'm gonna hold it up closer so I have a little bit more precision control, and I'm gonna gently tap it down. Okay, and I actually think I want to go to, looking at it now, think I want to go to a bigger size. Okay, so I hold it really still and I hold it down here, and I'm gonna use my steel hammer to gently. And y'all can see how already, do you see there's a little bell on the top?
It's like a bowl.
It looks like a little bowl. And that's a feeling of aesthetics. However wide you want it to be, it's your choice. Okay? So I want it to have a little bit more of a bell. It needs to have enough of a bell that when I put another ring around this ring, the ring doesn't slide off the other side. So I'm getting a bell about like that right now. All right? And then what I can do is I flip it over. Now, I don't want to bell it now because then I can't get a ring on it.
Oh, true.
So but I have to remember which one I use. This one is number 22.
How do you see that? Oh, okay.
Okay. And they're here too. They're on the block. It actually has which ones are written. But you can also remember 1, 2, 3 if you want to do it that way. That one was number 22. What I then have to do, which this is a little bit of a struggle, is I have to look at it and decide how many rings and what type of ring I want to slide over this. You could have just one that spins. You could have 2 or 3 or 4.
So it's not another like band type. It's like skin.
It's, well, yes. Remember in the beginning though, I told you that I probably would have made it a little bit thicker. But what's going to happen is eventually I'm going to have those other rings sitting on it. They'll be looser. And then when I bell the other side, they can turn, but they don't slide off. They're stuck onto the band. And it gives me a look of something like that. So I could mix metals. I could do brass. I could do silver nickel. I could do sterling silver. I could do copper. Obviously we don't have 14 karat or rose gold or white gold, yellow gold, etc. But those are all options as well. The trick is that you have to make a ring that is big enough to fit around this ring. So this ring is a size 6.5-ish. So I really need to be going for a 7.5 to an 8. But if I make a 12, it's just going to do what? It's just going to fall off the other side. So I generally do a size to a size and a half bigger. And that usually gives me enough clearance to go around the spinner ring. And I can make as many rings as I want. When I get it the way that I want, I come back with a dapping set, slide all the rings on. Oops, this is the wrong hammer. Punch, 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 and they're permanently on there. And then, of course, we can go into polishing and For this one, I would probably just use the tumbler polisher because you don't have to worry about anything getting work hardened. It's a pretty sturdy ring, so I probably wouldn't spend the time to polish it with the ZAM on the flex shaft drill. But you could, if you really wanted to sand something out, or if there was a little piece of solder or something, you could file it off either by hand or with the flex shaft. Maya asked a good question. She was like, before I soldered the band together, if I wanted to treat the band, like saw into it, like if you wanted to saw into it and cut holes out of it, you would have to use the flex shaft drill to get the holes first, and then you could saw in, or you could even use a disc cutter to cut holes out of the band. But anything like that you want to do before you measure and cut it, because if you're banging on it with any type of hammer, if you're treating it with any of the rolling mill that we have, you could, instead of putting it through the rolling mill to get a texture, you could hit it with a texture hammer, and you could get little dimples or decals in it that way. But anything that you do like that is warping the metal. So then you're going to have to remeasure. So anything that you do like that, whether it's cutting, hitting, rolling, you do that first, and then you measure the right length for your size, and then you solder. And you might want to wash it really well too, because if you get oil on it from another machine or something, it's not as clean, and the solder's not going to want to stick to it. Okay. Anybody have other questions while I'm here? Yes, no, maybe.
This chair's getting really uncomfortable.
All right, we can take a stretch.